She opened her mouth and changed her place in the carriage from agitation produced by a sudden thought if I could be anything but his mistress, passionately loving nothing but his caresses. But I cannot and do not want to be anything else, and this desire awakens disgust in him, and that arouses anger in me. And it cannot be otherwise. Don't I know that he would not deceive me, that he has no designs on that Sarakina, that he is not in love with Kitty, and will not be unfaithful to me, I know. All that, but that does not make it easier for me if without loving me he is kind and tender to me from a sense of duty. But what I desire is lacking. That would be 1,000 times worse than anger. It would be hell. That is just how it is. He has long ceased to love me. And where love ceases, there hate begins. I don't know these streets at all. Here is a hill, and houses. But in the houses are people, and more people. There is no end to them, and they all hate one another. Well, supposing I picture to myself what I want in order to be happy. Well, I get divorced, and Alexei Alexandrovich gives me Shretza, and I marry Bronxy, remembering Karen, and she pictured him to herself with extraordinary vividness, as if he stood before her with his mild, dull, lifeless eyes, the blue veins of his white hands, his intonations, his cracking fingers, and remembering the feeling that had once existed between them, and which had also been called love, she shuddered with revulsion. Well, I get divorced and become Vronsky's wife. But then will Kitty cease looking at me as she did this afternoon? No, will Soretta stop asking and wondering about my two husbands? And between Vronsky and myself, what new feeling can I invent? Is any kind not of happiness, even but of absence of torture, possible? No, she now answered herself without the least hesitation. It is impossible. Life is sundering us, and I am the cause of his unhappiness, and he of mine, and neither he nor I can be made different. Every effort has been made, but the screws have given way. A beggar woman with a baby, she thinks I pity her. Are we not all flung into the world only to hate each other, and therefore to torment ourselves and others? There go schoolboys, they are laughing cigarettes. Ah, she remembered I thought I loved him too, and was touched at my own tenderness for him, yet I lived without him and exchanged his love for another's, and did not complain of the change as long as the other love satisfied me. And she thought with disgust of what she called the other love. The clearness with which she now saw her own and everyone else's life pleased her. It's the same with me and Petra and Theodore the coachman, and with that tradesman, and with all the people that live away there by the Volga, where those advertisements invite one to go, and everywhere. And always she thought as she drove up to the low building of the Nijben station, where the porters ran out to meet her, should I take a ticket to Obralovka? Asked Pyotr. She had quite forgotten where and why she was going, and only understood the question by a great effort. Yes, she said, giving him her purse, and hanging her little red handbag on her arm, she descended from the carriage. As she moved among the crowd toward the first-class waiting room, she gradually recalled all the details of her position, and the resolutions between which she vacillated, and again hope and despair alternately chafing the old sores lacerated the wounds of her tortured and violently fluttering heart, sitting on the star-shaped couch waiting for her train. She looked with repulsion at those who passed in and out. They were all objectionable to her. She thought now of how she would reach the station, and would write him a note, and of what she would write, and of how he was now, without understanding her sufferings, complaining of his position to his mother, and of how she would enter the room, and what she would say to him. And then she thought how happy life might still be, and how tormentingly she loved and hated him, and how dreadfully her heart was beating. Chapter 31. The bell rang. Some young men, ugly and bold-faced, passed by hurriedly, and yet attentive to the impression they created. Pieter in his livery, and Gaiters with his dull animal face, also crossed the room, and came to her to see her into the train. Two noisy men became quiet as she passed them on the platform, and one of them whispered to the other something about her. Something nasty, of course. She mounted the high step of the railway carriage and seated herself in an empty compartment on the dirty, though once white cover of the spring seat. Pyotr, with a stupid smile, raised his gold-braided hat to take leave of her. An insolent guard slammed the door and drew the latch. A misshapen lady with a bustle ornamentally stripped that woman, and was horrified at her deformity, and a girl, laughing affectedly, ran past outside. Katrina and Raevna has everything, Mata, cried the little girl, quite a child, and yet already affected and pulling faces. Thought Anna. In order not to see anyone, she rose quickly and sat down at the opposite window of the empty compartment. A grimy, misshapen peasant in a cap from under which his tousled hair stuck out past that window stooping over the carriage wheels. There is something familiar about that misshapen peasant, she thought, and remembering her dream, she went to the opposite door, trembling with fright. The guard opened it to let in a husband and wife. "Do you wish to get out on it?" did not answer. Neither the guard nor those entering noticed the horror on her face. Beneath the veil, she went back to her corner and sat down. The couple sat down opposite her, attentively but stealthily examining her dress. Both the husband and the wife seemed to honor disgusting. The husband asked if she would allow him to smoke, evidently not because he wanted to, but to enter into conversation with her. Having received her permission, he began speaking to his wife in French about things he wanted to speak about, still less than he wanted to smoke. They talked nonsense insincerely, only in order that she should hear them. Anna saw distinctly how weary they were of one another and how they hated each other, and it was impossible not to hate such ugly wretches. She heard the second bell ring, and then a moving of luggage, noise, shouting, and laughter. It was so clear to Anna that no one had any cause for joy that this laughter jarred on her painfully, and she wished to stop her ears not to hear it. At last the third bell rang, the engine whistled and creaked, the coupling chains gave a jerk, and the husband crossed himself. It would be interesting to ask him what he means by it, thought Anna, regarding him spitefully. She looked out of the window past the lady at the people on the platform who had been seeing the train off and who appeared to be gliding backward with rhythmic jerks over the joints of the rails. The carriage in which Anna sat rattled past the platform and a brick wall past the signals and some other carriages. The sound of wheels slightly ringing against the rails became more rhythmic and smooth. The bright evening sunshine shone through the window and a breeze moved the blind. Anna forgot her fellow travelers, softly rocked by the motion of the carriage and inhaling the fresh air. She again began to think, where did I leave off? At the point that I cannot imagine a situation in which life would not be a torment, that we all have been created in order to suffer, and that we all know this and all try to invent means of deceiving ourselves. But when you see the truth, what do you to do? Reason has been given to man to enable him to escape from his troubles, said the lady in French, evidently pleased with her phrase, and mincing with her tongue. These words seemed to answer Anna's thought. To escape from his troubles, Anna mentally repeated, and glancing at the red-cheeked husband and his thin wife, she saw that the sickly wife considered herself misunderstood, and that the husband deceived her and encouraged her in her opinion of herself, directing her searchlight upon them. Anna thought she saw their story in all the hidden recesses of their souls, but there was nothing of interest there, and she continued her reflections. Yes, it troubles me very much, and reason was given us to enable us to escape. Therefore I must escape. Why not put out the candle if there is nothing more to look at, if everything is repulsive to look at? But how? Why did the guard run past holding the handrail? Why are those young men in the next carriage shouting? Why are they talking and laughing? It's all untrue, all lies, all deception, all evil. When the train stopped at the station, Anna got out with the crowd of passengers and, shunning them as if they were lepers, stopped on the platform, trying to remember why she had come there and what she had intended to do. Everything that had appeared possible before was now so difficult to grasp, especially in this noisy crowd of odious people who would not leave her in peace. Porters rushed up offering their services. Young men passed along the platform clattering their heels on the planks, talking loudly and gazing at her, and people she met tried to get out of her way on the wrong side. Recollecting that she meant to go on, if there was no reply, she stopped a porter and asked him whether there was not a coachman bringing a note from Count Bronsky. Their Count Bronsky is someone from there, was here just now to meet the Princess Surakina and her daughter. What is the coachman like? While she was talking to the porter Mikkel, the coachman, rosy and cheerful, came up in his smart blue coat with a watch chain, evidently proud of having carried out his errand so well, and handed her a note. She opened it, and her heart sank even before she read it. Very sorry, the note did not catch me. I shall be back at 10. Vronsky wrote in a careless hand. Yes, I expected it, she said to herself with a malicious smile. All right, you may go home, she said softly to Mikhail. She spoke softly because the rapid beating of her heart impeded her breathing. How I will not let you torture me, she thought, addressing her threat not to him nor to herself, but to that which forced her to suffer. And she walked along the platform past the station buildings to maids, servants strolling about on the platform turned their heads to look at her and made some audible remarks about her dress. "It's real," they said of the lace she was wearing. The young men did not leave her in peace, gazing into her face and laughing and shouting unnaturally. They again passed by. The station master asked her in passing whether she was going on. A boy Salnikov's fixed his eyes on her. "Oh God, where am I to go?" she thought, walking further and further along the platform. She stopped at the end of it. Some ladies and children who had come to meet a spectacled gentleman and were laughing and talking noisily became silent and gazed at her as she passed them. She walked faster away from them to the very end of the platform. A goods train was approaching. The platform shook, and it seemed to her as if she were again in the train. Suddenly remembering the man who had been run over the day she first met Vronsky, she realized what she had to do. Quickly and lightly descending the steps that led from the water tank to the rails, she stopped close to the passing train. She looked at the bottom of the trucks, at the bolts and chains and large iron wheels of the slowly moving front truck, and tried to estimate the middle point between the front and back wheels, and the moment when that point would be opposite her. There, she said to herself, looking at the shadow of the truck on the mingled sand and cold dust which covered the sleepers there, into the very middle, and I shall punish him and escape from everybody and from myself. She wanted to fall halfway between the wheels of the front truck, which was drawing level with her, but the little red handbag, which she began to take off her arm, delayed her. And then it was too late. The middle had passed her. She was obliged to wait for the next truck. A feeling seized her, like that she had experienced when preparing to enter the water in bathing, and she crossed herself. The familiar gesture of making the sign of the cross called up a whole series of girlish and childish memories, and suddenly the darkness that obscured everything for her broke, and life showed itself to her for an instant with all its bright past joys. But she did not take her eyes off the wheels of the approaching second truck, and at the very moment when the midway point between the wheels drew level, she threw away her red bag and, drawing her head down between her shoulders, threw herself forward on her hands under the truck, and with a light movement as if preparing to rise, again immediately dropped on her knees. And at the same moment she was horror-struck at what she was doing. What am I doing? Why? She wished to rise to throw herself back, but something huge and relentless struck her on the head and dragged her down. "God forgive me, everything," she said, feeling the impossibility of struggling. A little peasant muttering something was working at the rails, the candle by the light of which she had been reading that book filled with anxieties, deceptions, grief and evil flared up with a brighter light, lit up for her all that had before been dark, crackled, began to flicker, and went out forever. Part 8, Chapter 1. Nearly 2 months had gone by. It was already the middle of the hot summer, but Sergei Ivanitch Kosnachev was only now preparing to leave Moscow. In Kosnachev's life during that time, events of importance for him had taken place. His book, the result of 6 years' labor, entitled An Attempt to Review the Foundations and Forms of Government of Europe and Russia, had been finished a year ago, some parts of it, and the introduction had appeared in periodicals, and other parts had been read by Kosnachev to people of his set, so that the ideas of the work could not be very novel to the public. But all the same, Kosnachev expected that the publication of the book would create a serious impression on society, and if not a revolution in science, at any rate a strong agitation in the scientific world. The book had been issued last year, after careful revision, and had been sent out to the booksellers, not asking anyone about it, reluctantly, and with feigned indifference, replying to his friends' inquiries as to how it was going, and not even asking the booksellers how it was selling. Kosnachev watched keenly and with strained attention for the first impression his book would produce in society and in literature. But a week passed, and another, and a third, and no impression was noticeable in society. His friends, the specialists, and the scholars, sometimes from politeness mentioned it. His other acquaintances, not interested in learned works, did not mention it to him at all. In society, now particularly occupied with something else, absolute indifference reigned in the periodicals. Also, for a whole month there had not been any mention of the book. Kosnachev had calculated exactly the time necessary for a review to be written, but a month passed, and another, and the silence continued. Only in the northern beetle, in a facetious fable about the singer Drabanti, who had lost his voice, were a few contemptuous remarks interpolated about Kossakovsky's book, indicating that it had long ago been condemned by everybody and consigned to general ridicule at last. In the third month, a criticism appeared in a serious magazine. Krushenkov knew the author of the article. He had met him once at Golubkov's. The author was a very young and sickly journalist, very bold as a writer, but extremely uneducated and shy in personal intercourse. Despite his entire contempt for this man, Kossakovsky began reading the review. Most respectfully, the article was horrible. The critic had evidently understood the book in an impossible way, but he had so adroitly selected his quotations that to those who had not read the book, and evidently hardly anyone had read it, it would appear quite clear that the whole book was nothing but a collection of high-sounding words not even used appropriately, as was indicated by notes of interrogation, and that its author was a totally ignorant man. All this was put with so much wit that Kossakovsky himself would not have been averse to wielding it, and that was what was dreadful. Notwithstanding the thorough conscientiousness with which Kossakovsky verified the correctness of the critic's arguments, he did not dwell for a moment on the deficiencies and mistakes which were ridiculed, but at once involuntarily began to recall his meeting and conversation with the author of the review down to the minutest details. Did not I offend him in some way, he asked himself, and remembering how when he met him he had corrected the young man's use of a word that betrayed ignorance, Krushenkov found an explanation of the article. That review was followed by dead silence, both in print and in conversation concerning the book, and Kossakovsky saw that his 6 years' work carried out with so much devotion and labor was entirely thrown away. His position was the more painful because, having finished his book, he no longer had any literary work such as had previously occupied the greater part of his time. He was intelligent, well-educated, healthy, and active, but did not know how to employ his energy. Discussions in drawing rooms, at meetings, at assemblies, in committees, and everywhere where one could speak took up part of his time. But as an habitual town dweller, he did not allow himself to be entirely absorbed by discussions, as his inexperienced brother did when he was in Moscow, so he had much superfluous leisure and mental energy. Fortunately for him, at this most trying time, after the failure of his book, in place of the questions of dissent, our American friends, the Samra famine, the exhibitions, and spiritualism, the Slavonic question, which had previously only smoldered in society, came to the front, and Koshlev, who had previously been one of the promoters of that cause, devoted himself to it entirely. Among the people to whom he belonged, nothing was written or talked about at that time except the Serbian War. Everything that the idle crowd usually does to kill time, it now did for the benefit of the slaves. Balls, concerts, dinners, speeches, ladies' dresses, beer, restaurants, all bore witness to our sympathy with the slaves. With much that was spoken and written on the subject, Kossakovsky did not agree in detail. He saw that the Slav question had become one of those fashionable diversions which, ever succeeding one another, served to occupy society. He saw that too many people took up the question from interested motives. He admitted that the papers published much that was unnecessary and exaggerated with the sole aim of drawing attention to themselves, each outcrying the other. He saw that amid this general elation in society, those who were unsuccessful or discontented leapt to the front and shouted louder than anyone else. Commanders-in-chief without armies, ministers without portfolios, journalists without papers, and party leaders without followers. He saw there was much that was frivolous and ridiculous, but he also saw and admitted the unquestionable and ever-growing enthusiasm which was uniting all classes of society, and with which one could not help sympathizing. The massacre of our co-religionists and brother slaves evoked sympathy for the sufferers and indignation against their oppressors, and the heroism of the Serbs and Montenegrins fighting for a great cause aroused in the whole nation a desire to help their brothers, not only with words, but by deeds also. There was an accompanying fact that pleased Kossakovsky. It was the manifestation of public opinion. The nation had definitely expressed its wishes. As Kossakovsky put it, the soul of the nation had become articulate. The more he went into this question, the clearer it seemed to him that it was a matter which would attain enormous proportions and become epoch-making. He devoted himself completely to the service of that great movement and forgot to think about his book. His whole time was now so taken up that he was unable to answer all the letters and demands addressed to him. After working all through the spring and part of the summer, it was not till July that he prepared to go to his brothers in the country. He went both to enjoy a fortnight's rest, and in that holy of holies of the people, the very heart of the country, to enjoy the sight of that uplift of the national spirit of which he and all the town dwellers were fully convinced. Kataversov, who had promised Lyavin to visit him, and had long been meaning to keep that promise, accompanied Kosnovich chapter to hardly had Kosenko and Kovatov reached the station, got out of their carriage and looked for the footmen, who had followed with their luggage before some volunteers drove up with for Icevor's chicks. The volunteers were met by ladies who brought them nosegays, and who with the crowd that rushed after them accompanied them into the station. One of the ladies who had met the volunteers spoke to Kosnchev at the exit from the waiting room. "You two have come to see them off?" she asked in French. "No, princess, I am going to my brother's for a rest." "And do you always come to see them off?" he asked with a slight smile. "How can one help it?" replied the princess. "Is it true that 800 have already gone from here?" Marvinsky would not believe me. "More than 800, counting those who did not go from Moscow direct. More than 1,000, said Kosnchev. "There now, I said so," the lady said joyfully. "And isn't it true that about 1,000,000 rubles have been collected?" "More than that, princess." "And what a telegram there is today. They have beaten the Turks again." "Yes, I read it," he answered. They were talking of the latest telegram confirming the report that for 3 consecutive days the Turks had been beaten at all points and were in flight, and that a decisive battle was expected next day. "Oh, I say, there is a splendid young man who wants to go. I don't know why they are making difficulties. I wish to speak to you about him. I know him. Please write a note for him." He was sent by the Countess Lydia Ivanovna, having obtained such details as the princess could give about the young petitioner. Kosnchev went into the first-class waiting room, wrote a note to the person on whom the decision depended, and gave it to the princess. "Do you know that the well-known Count Bronsky is going by this train?" remarked the princess with a triumphant and significant smile when Kosnchev had found her again and given her the note. "I heard he was going, but did not know when going by this train. I have seen him. He is here. Only his mother is seeing him off after all. It is the best thing he could do." "Oh, yes, certainly." While they were speaking, the crowd rushed past them toward the dining table. They too moved on and heard the loud voice of a man who, with a glass in his hand, was making a speech to the volunteers to serve the faith, humanity, and our brothers, said the gentleman, raising his voice more and more. "Mother Moscow blesses you in the great undertaking. Shivu," he concluded in a loud and tearful voice. Everyone shouted "Shivio," and a fresh crowd surged into the refreshment room, nearly knocking the princess off her feet. "Ah, princess, what do you think of that?" said Obronsky, beaming with a joyous smile as he suddenly appeared in the midst of the crowd. "Wasn't it finely and cordially expressed?" "Bravo, and Sergei Ivanitch, now you should say something so that just a few words, you know, of encouragement. You're doing so well," he added with an affectionate, respectful, and solicitous smile, gently pushing Kosnchev forward by the arm. "No, I am just going where to my brothers in the country," answered Kosnchev. "Oh, then you'll see my wife. I have written to her, but you'll see her sooner. Please tell her you have seen me, and it's all right. She will understand. However, tell her, if you'll be so kind, that I am appointed member of the committee of the joint." "Oh, but she will understand, you know." "Lepeti nest pada la vida vumen," he said to the princess as if to excuse himself. "And the princess Myakaya, not Lisa. But Bibish is really sending 1,000 rifles and 12 nurses, did I tell you?" "Yes, I have heard," replied Kosnchev reluctantly. "What a pity you're going away," said Oblonsky. "Tomorrow we're giving a dinner to 2 of those who are going to the war, Dmitry Bartnansky from Petersburg and our Vasilkovsky Vasenka. They are both going. Veslovsky married recently, a fine fellow, isn't he, princess?" he added, turning to the lady. The princess, without replying, glanced at Kosnchev. But the fact that Kosnchev and the princess seemed to wish to get rid of him did not abash Oblonsky in the least. He looked smilingly now at the feather on the princess's bonnet, and now about him, as if trying to remember something. Noticing a lady with a collecting box, he beckoned to her and put in a 5-ruble note. "I can't look calmly at those collecting boxes while I have any money," he remarked. "And what a telegram that was today. Fine fellows, those Montenegrins." "You don't say so," he exclaimed when the princess told him that Bronsky was going by that train. For a moment Obronsky's face looked sad, but a Minute later, when with a slight spring in his step and smoothing his whiskers he entered the waiting room where Vronsky was Oblonsky had quite forgotten how he had sobbed with despair over his sister's corpse, and he saw in Vronsky only a hero and an old friend with all of his faults. One must do him justice, the princess said to Koshev as soon as Oblonsky had left them. His is a thoroughly Russian slovenly nature, only I'm afraid it will be painful for Oblonsky to see him say what you will that. Man's fate touches me. Have a talk with him on the journey, said the princess. Yes, I might if opportunity offers. I never liked him, but this atones for much. Not only is he going himself, but he is taking a whole squadron at his own expense. So I heard the bell rang. Everybody thronged toward the door. There he is, said the princess, pointing to Vronsky, who in a long overcoat and a black broad-brimmed hat was passing with his mother on his arm. Oblonsky walked beside him, talking with animation. Vronsky was frowning and looking straight before him, as if not hearing what Oblonsky was saying. Probably at Oblonsky's indication, he looked round to where Kosneshev and the princess were standing and silently raised his hat. His face, which was aged and full of suffering, seemed petrified. Coming up to the train, Vronsky, letting his mother pass before him, silently disappeared into one of the compartments on the platform. God Save the Tsar was struck up, followed by Hurrah and Shayboy. One of the volunteers, a tall, hollow-chested, very young man, was bowing in a specially noticeable way, waving over his head a felt hat and a bouquet from behind him to officers, and an elderly man with a large beard and a greasy cap thrust their heads out and also bowed. Chapter 3. Having taken leave of the Princess, Kosneshev, with Katavasov, who had joined him, entered the very crowded carriage, and the train started at the Saretsino station. The train was met by a melodious choir of young people, singing Slava. Again the volunteers bowed and thrust their heads out, but Kosenko did not pay attention to them. He had had so much to do with volunteers that he was already familiar with their general type, and it did not interest him. Katavasov, however, whose scientific occupations had offered him no opportunities of studying the volunteers, was much interested in them and questioned Kosnovtsov about them. Kosnovtsov advised him to go into the second-class carriage and have a talk with some of them at the next station. Katavasov followed this advice. As soon as the train stopped, he changed carriages and made acquaintance with the volunteers. They were sitting in a corner, talking loudly, evidently aware that the attention of their fellow passengers and of Katavasov, who had just entered, was directed toward them. The tall, hollow-chested young man talked louder than any of them. He was evidently drunk and was speaking of something that had happened at his school. Opposite him sat an officer, no longer young, wearing a military jacket of the Austrian Guards. He listened smilingly to the young man and tried to stop him. The third volunteer, wearing an artillery uniform, sat beside them on a trunk. A fourth one was asleep. Getting into conversation with the young man, Katavasov learned that he had been a rich Moscow merchant, but had run through a large fortune before he was 20. Katavasov did not like him because he was effeminate, spoiled, and delicate. He was evidently sure, especially now, that he was tipsy, that he was performing an heroic deed, and he bragged most unpleasantly. Another, a retired officer, also produced an unpleasant impression on Katavasov. He was apparently a man who had tried everything. He had had a post on the railway, been a steward, and had started factories, and he talked about it all quite needlessly, using inappropriate technical terms. But Katavasov liked the third, an artilleryman, very much. He was a modest, quiet man who evidently deferred to the knowledge of the retired guardsman and to the heroic self-sacrifice of the merchant, and did not talk at all about himself. When Katavasov asked him what prompted him to go to Serbia, he modestly replied, "Well, everybody is going. One must help the Serbs. One's sorry for them. Yes, it's particularly artillery men they're short of," said Katavasov. "But I have not served long in the artillery. Perhaps they'll put me in the infantry or cavalry." "Why into the infantry when they need artillery men most of all?" said Katavasov, concluding from the artilleryman's age that he must have risen to a considerable rank. "I did not serve in the artillery long. I am a retired cadet," he said, and began to explain why he had not passed the examination for a commission. All this put together produced on Katavasov a disagreeable impression, and when the volunteers got out at the station to have a drink, he wished to verify this unfavorable impression by a talk with somebody. One of the passengers, an old man in a military overcoat, had been listening all the time to Katavarsov's conversation with the volunteers. When they were left alone together, Katavarsov addressed him. What a variety there is in the positions of all these men. Who are going there? Katavarsov remarked, vaguely wishing to express his own opinion, but at the same time to draw the old man. The old soldier had been through 2 campaigns. He knew what a military man ought to be, and by the appearance and talk of those men, and by the swagger with which they applied themselves to their flasks, on the way he considered them bad soldiers. Besides that, he lived in a provincial town, and wanted to speak of a discharged soldier of his town who had volunteered, a drunkard and thief who no one would employ any longer, but knowing by experience that in the present state of public feeling it was dangerous to express any opinion contrary to the prevailing one, and especially dangerous to censure the volunteers. He also watched Katavarsov. Well, men are wanted there, he said with laughing eyes, and they began talking about the latest war news, each concealing from the other his perplexity as to whom tomorrow's battle was to be with, since the Turks, according to the latest intelligence, had been beaten at all points, and so they parted without either of them having expressed his opinion. Katavarsov, returning to his carriage, involuntarily prevaricated, and in telling Kosakov his observations of the volunteers, let it appear that they were excellent fellows. At the station of a big town, the volunteers were again greeted with songs and cheers. Again women and men turned up with collecting boxes. The provincial ladies presented nosegays and accompanied the volunteers to the refreshment bar. But all this was far feebler and weaker than in Moscow. Chapter 4. When the train stopped at the provincial capital, Kosnichov, instead of going to the refreshment room, walked up and down the platform. The first time he passed the Vronsky's compartment, he noticed that the blind was down, but the next time he passed, he saw the old countess at the window. She beckoned to him. "You see, I am going with him as far as Kusk," said she. "Yes, so I heard," replied Kosnichev, stopping by her window and glancing inside. "What a fine action this is of his," he added, noticing that Vronsky was not there. "Yes, but after his misfortune, what could he do?" "What a dreadful occurrence," remarked Kosnichev. "Oh, what I have endured." "But come and oh, what I have endured," she repeated, when Kosnichev had entered and taken a seat beside her. "You cannot imagine it. For 6 weeks he spoke to no one, and ate only when I implored him to. One could not leave him a moment alone. We took away everything that he could kill himself with. We lived on the ground floor, but one could not tell what he might. Do you know, he had once before shot himself on her account," she said, and the old woman's brows knit at the recollection. Yes, she ended as such a woman deserved to end. Even the death she chose was mean, and lo, it is not for us to judge. Countess Kosnichev remarked with a sigh, "But I understand how distressing it was for you. Oh, don't speak of it. I was living on my estate, and he was with me. A note was brought. He wrote an answer and sent it off. We had no idea that she was herself there at the station in the evening. I had only just gone to my room when my Maria told me that at the station a lady had thrown herself under a train. I felt as if I had received a blow. I knew it was she. The first thing I said was, 'Don't tell him,' but he had already been told. His coachman had been there and saw it all. When I ran to his room, he was beside himself. It was terrible to see him. He did not say a word, but off he galloped to the station. I don't know what happened there, but they brought him back like a corpse. I should not have known him. Prostrato completo, the doctor said. Then came raving madness, almost and can't speak of it," exclaimed the countess with a gesture of her arm. "A terrible time. No, say what you will. She was a bad woman. Such desperate passions, only to prove something unusual. Well, she proved it. She ruined herself and to splendid men, her husband and my unfortunate son." "And how about her husband?" inquired Kosnichev. "He took our little girl Alexei. At first agreed to everything, but now he is greatly distressed at having given up his daughter to a stranger. But he can't go back on his word." Karenin came to the funeral, but we tried to arrange so that he and Alexei should not meet. For him, the husband, it is better. She has set him free. But my poor son had given himself up to her entirely. He had thrown up everything, his career, me. And then she did not even pity him, but deliberately dealt him a death blow. No, say what you will. Her death itself was the death of a horrid woman without religion. God forgive me, I cannot help hating her memory when I see my son's ruin. But how is he now? It is a God-sent help for us, this Serbian war. I am an old woman and understand nothing about it. But for him it is a godsend. Of course I as his mother fear for him, and above all I hear that Cenebritribivia Petersburg, but can't be held it, was the only thing that could rouse him. His friend Yashvine had lost everything at cards and was going to Serbia. He came to see him and persuaded him to go. Now it interests him. Please have a talk with him. I want him to have some distraction. He's so sad. Unluckily too, his teeth have started aching, but he will be very glad to see you. Please have a talk with him. He is walking about on the other side. Kosychev said he would be very pleased and crossed over to the other platform. Chapter 5. In the slanting shadow of a pile of sacks heaped up on the platform, Vronsky, in a long overcoat, his hat pulled down low, and his hands in his pockets, was walking up and down like an animal in a cage, turning sharply every 20 paces to Kosnyshev. As he approached, it seemed that Vronsky saw but pretended not to see him. But Kosnyshev did not care. He was above any personal considerations. With Vronsky in his eyes, Vronsky at that moment seemed an important worker in a great cause, and Khrushchev considered it his duty to encourage and cheer him. He went up to him. Vronsky paused, looked at Kosnyshev, recognized him, and advancing a few steps to meet him, pressed his hand very, very hard. Perhaps you did not wish to see me, said Kosnyshev, but can I not be of some use to you? There is no one whom it would be less unpleasant for me to meet than yourself, returned Vronsky. Excuse me, there is nothing that is pleasant in life for me, I understand, and I wanted to offer you my services, said Kosnyshev, gazing into Vronsky's face, which bore evident signs of suffering. Do you not want a letter to Rostock or to Milan? Oh no, replied Vronsky, as if it cost him an effort to understand. If you don't mind, let us walk up and down, it is so stuffy. In the carriage a letter? No thank you, no introductions are needed to enable one to die, unless indeed to the Turks, he added, smiling with his lips only. His eyes retained their expression of angry suffering. Yes, but it may be easier for you to establish connections, which will be necessary anyway, with someone who has been prepared. However, as you please. I was very glad to hear of your decision. The volunteers are being very much attacked, and a man like yourself will raise them in public opinion. As a man I have this quality, that I do not value my life at all, and that I have physical energy enough to hack my way into a square and slay or fall, that I am sure of. I am glad that there is something for which I can lay down the life which I not only do not want, but of which I am sick. It will be of use to somebody. And he moved his jaw impatiently, because of the incessant gnawing pain in his tooth, which even prevented him from speaking with the expression he desired. You will recover, I prophesy it, said Kosnyshev, feeling touched. To free one's brothers from oppression is an aim worth both dying and living for. God grant you outward success and inward peace, he added, holding out his hand. Von Reisky grasped the hand warmly. Yes, as a tool I may be of some use, but as a man I am a ruin, said he, pausing between the words. The acute pain in the strong tooth filling his mouth with saliva hindered his speaking. He remained silent, gazing at the wheels of the approaching tender, which was slowly and smoothly gliding over the rails. Suddenly a quite different feeling, not of pain, but of tormenting inward discomfort, made him for a moment forget his toothache. At the sight of the tender and the rails, and under the influence of conversation with someone he had not met since the catastrophe, he suddenly remembered her, that is, remembered what was left of her, when like a madman he ran into the railway shed, where on the table, stretched out shamelessly before the eyes of strangers, lay the mangled body, still warm with recent life, the head left intact with its heavy plaits, and the curls around the temples was thrown back, and on the lovely face, with its half-open red lips, was frozen an expression pitiful on the lips and horrible in the fixed open eyes, an expression which repeated as if in words the terrible phrase about his repenting it, which she had uttered during their quarrel. He tried to remember her as she was when he had met her the first time, also at a railway station, mysterious, charming, loving, seeking and giving joy, and not cruelly vindictive. As he remembered her at the last, he tried to recall his best moments with her, but they were forever poisoned. He could think of her only as triumphant, having carried out the threat of inflicting on him totally useless but irrevocable remorse. He ceased to feel the pain in his tooth, and sobs distorted his face. Having twice walked past the sacks and mastered himself, he turned calmly to Kosnyshev. You have not seen any telegram later than yesterday's? Yes, they have been beaten a third time, but a decisive battle is expected tomorrow. And having spoken about the proposed proclamation of Milan as king and of the immense results this Might have they returned to their respective carriages after the second bell had already sounded. Chapter 6. As he had not known when he would be able to leave Moscow, Kosintsev had not sent a telegram to his brother asking to be met at the station, and Levin was not at home when toward noon Katavasov and Kosnovich, dark as Arabs, with the dust in the little tarantas they had hired at the station, drew up at the porch of the Prokofsk house. Kitty, who was sitting on the balcony with her father and sister, recognized her brother-in-law and ran down to meet him. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself for not letting us know?" she said, holding out her hand to him and offering her forehead for a kiss. "We got here first rate without troubling you," replied Kosnishev. "I am so dusty that I dare not touch you. I was so busy that I did not know when I could tear myself away. And you, as usual," said he, smiling, "are enjoying tranquil happiness outside the currents in your peaceful shallows, and here is our friend Theodore Vasilovich, who has come at last. But I am not a Negro when I have had a wash. I shall look like a human being," Kovatov said in his usual jesting way, holding out his hand and smiling, his teeth looking particularly bright in contrast with his black face. "Kostash will be so pleased. He has gone to the farm. It is time he was back, always busy with his husbandry in the shallows." "Hits it exactly," remarked Katavarsov, "and we in town can see nothing but the Serbian war. Well, and what does my friend think of it?" "Surely not the same as other people." "Oh, nothing in particular, the same as everybody," Kitty answered, rather embarrassed and glancing round at Kosnishev. "Well, I'll send for him. Papa is staying with us. He has not long returned from abroad, and having arranged that Levin should be sent for, and that the dusty visitors should be shown where to wash, one of them in Levin's study and the other in Dolly's former room, and about lunch for them." Kitty, exercising the right of moving quickly, of which she had been deprived during pregnancy, ran up the balcony stairs. "It's Sergei Ivanovich in Katravsov, the professor," said she. "Oh, how trying in this heat," said the prince. "No, Papa, he's very nice, and Kostya is very fond of him," Kitty replied with a smile, as of entreaty, having noticed a sarcastic expression on her father's face. "I don't mind, you go and entertain them." "Dear," Kitty said to her sister, "they met Stever at the station. He is quite well, and I will run to meet you as ill luck will have it. I have not fed him since breakfast. He will be awake now, and is certainly screaming." And feeling the flow of milk, she went with rapid steps to the nursery. It was not a mere guess. The bond between herself and the baby had not yet been severed, and she knew surely by the flow of milk within herself that he was wanting food. She knew he was screaming before she reached the nursery, and so he was. She heard his voice and increased her speed, but the faster she went, the louder he screamed. It was a fine, healthy voice, only hungry and impatient. "Has he been screaming long, nurse?" "Long," she asked, hurriedly sitting down and preparing to nurse the baby. "Be quick and give him to me." "Oh, nurse, how tiresome you are. Come, you can tie up his cap afterwards." The baby was convulsed with hungry yells. "But one must, you know, Mom," said Agafya Mikhailovna, who was almost always in the nursery. "He must be properly tidied up." "Goo-goo," she cooed to him, paying no attention to the mother. The nurse brought the baby to his mother, and Agafya Mikhailovna followed behind, her face softened with tenderness. "He knows me, he does. It's God's truth, Katerina Alexandrovna. He knows me," said Agafya Mikhailovna, raising her voice above the baby's. But Kitty did not listen. Her impatience was increasing with the babies. As a result of their impatience, matters were long in getting settled. The baby got hold in the wrong place and was angry at last. After desperate screaming and choking, matters went smoothly, and both mother and child felt calmed and were silent. "But he, to poor mite, is all in a perspiration," whispered Kitty, feeling him with her hand. "Why do you think he knows you?" she added, moving her eyes so as to see the babies. They looked roguishly at her, she thought, from beneath his cap, which had slipped forward, and she watched the rhythmic rise and fall of his cheeks, and the little hand with the rosy palm, making circular movements. "It's impossible. If he knew anyone, it would be me," Kitty replied to Agafya Mikhailovna's statement, and smiled. She smiled because though she said it was impossible for him to know, she was sure in her heart that he not only knew Agafya Mikhailovna, but that he knew and understood everything, even many things that no one else knew, and which she, his mother, had learnt to know and understand through him. For Agafya Mikhailovna, for the nurse, for his grandfather, and even for his father, Mitya was a living being requiring only material care. But for his mother, he had already long been a moral being, with whom she had already had a long series of spiritual relations. "Well, wait till he wakes up and you will see for yourself when I do like that he quite brightens up the dear he brightens. Up like a sunny morning, said Agrafia Mikhailovna. Well, all right, we shall see, Kitty whispered. But now go away, he's falling asleep. Chapter 7. Agafia Mikhailovna went out on tiptoe. The nurse pulled down the blind, drove away the flies from under the muslin curtain of the cot, and also a bumblebee that was buzzing against the window pane, and sat down waving a birch branch above the mother and child. Oh, the heat, if God would only send a little rain, she said. Yes, hush, was all Kitty answered, as she sat softly rocking herself and tenderly pressing the little plump arm, which looked as if a thread had been tied round the wrist, and was still feebly waving while Misha kept shutting and opening his eyes. This hand disturbed Kitty. She wanted to kiss it, but was afraid to do so lest she should wake her baby. At last the arms ceased waving, and the eyes closed only now, and then the baby, continuing his business, lifted his long curved lashes and looked at his mother with moist eyes that seemed black in the dim light. The nurse stopped waving the branch and began to doze. From upstairs was heard the roll of the prince's voice and of Katavasov's laughter. I expect they've got into conversation in my absence, thought Kitty, but all the same it's provoking that Castor is away. I expect he's gone to the Epicurean again, though I am sorry that he goes there so often. Yet I'm also glad of it. It is a distraction for him. He is more cheerful now than he was in spring. Then he was so gloomy and suffered so much that I was becoming alarmed about him. And how funny he is, she whispered with a smile. She knew what was tormenting her husband. It was his want of faith. Although had she been asked whether she thought that if he did not believe in the future life he would perish, she would have had to acknowledge that he would. Yet his lack of faith did not make her unhappy, and she who accepted the doctrine that salvation was impossible for an unbeliever, while loving her husband's soul more than anything in the world, smiled when she thought of his disbelief and called him funny. Why has he been reading those philosophies for a whole year, she thought. If it's all written in those books, he can understand it. If what they say is untrue, why read them? He says himself that he would like to believe. Then why does he not believe? It must be because he thinks too much, and he thinks too much because of his solitude. He's always alone. He can't talk to us about everything. I think he will be glad of these visitors, especially of Katavarsov. He likes arguing with them, she reflected, and then turned her mind to the problem of where she had better arrange for Katavarsov to sleep, in a separate room or with Kosnashov. And here a thought suddenly struck her which made her start with excitement and even disturb Meteor, who gave her a severe look in consequence. I don't think the laundress has brought the things back, and the spare sheets are all in use. If I don't see to it, Agafia Mikhailovna will give Sergei Ivanitch used bed linen. And the very thought of this sent the blood into Kitty's face. Yes, I must see about it, she decided, and returning to her former train of thought, she remembered that there was something important, something spiritual that she had not yet thought out, and tried to recollect what it was. Oh yes, Kostya is an unbeliever, she thought again with a smile. Well, he is an unbeliever, better let him be that than be like Madame Stahl, or like what I wanted to be when I was abroad. No, he will never pretend. Then a recent proof of his kindness came vividly to her mind. 2 weeks before, Dolly had received a penitent letter from her husband. He implored her to save his honor and to sell her estate to pay his debts. Dolly was in despair. She hated her husband, despised him, pitied him, made up her mind to divorce him and to refuse, but ended by consenting to sell part of her estate. With an involuntary smile of emotion, Kitty remembered her own husband's shamefacedness after that, and his repeated awkward attempts to approach the subject he had on his mind, and how at length, having discovered the only way of helping Dolly without offending her, he suggested to Kitty that she should give her sister her own part of the estate, a device that had not occurred to her. How can he be an unbeliever with such a heart, and his dread of hurting anybody's feelings, even a child's? Everything for others, nothing for himself. Sergei Ivanitch quite regards it as Kostya's duty to act as his steward, and so does his sister. And now Dolly and her children are his wards. And then there are all those peasants who come to him every day as if it were his business to help them. Yes, only be like your father, only be like him, she whispered, giving Meteor to the nurse and touching his cheek with her lips. Chapter 8. Since the moment when, at the sight of his beloved and dying brother, Gavin for the first time looked at the questions of life and death in the light of the new convictions, as he called them, which between the ages of 20 and 34 had imperceptibly replaced the beliefs of his childhood and youth. He had been less horrified by death than by life, without the least knowledge of whence it came, what it is, for why, and what it is: organisms, their destruction, the indestructibility of matter, the law of the conservation of energy, development. The terms that had superseded these beliefs were very useful for mental purposes, but they gave no guidance for life, and Levin suddenly felt like a person who has exchanged a thick fur coat for a muslin garment, and who, being out in the frost for the first time, becomes clearly convinced, not by arguments, but with the whole of his being, that he is as good as naked, and that he must inevitably perish miserably from that moment without thinking about it. And though he continued living as he had done heretofore, Levin never ceased to feel afraid of his ignorance. Moreover, he was vaguely conscious that what he had called his convictions were really ignorance, and more than that, were a state of mind which rendered knowledge of what he needed impossible. At the commencement of his married life, the new joys and new duties he experienced completely stifled these thoughts. But lately, since his wife's confinement, while living in Moscow without any occupation, the problem demanding solution had presented itself more and more insistently to him. For him, the problem was this: if I don't accept the replies offered by Christianity to the questions my life presents, what solutions do I accept? And he not only failed to find in the whole arsenal of his convictions any kind of answer, but he could not even find anything resembling an answer. He was in the position of a man seeking for food in a toy shop or at a gunsmith's. Involuntarily and unconsciously, in every book, in every conversation, and in every person he met, he now sought for their relation to those questions and for a solution to them. What astounded and upset him most in this connection was that the majority of those in his set and of his age, having like himself replaced their former beliefs by new convictions like his own, did not see anything to be distressed about, and were quite contented and tranquil, so that besides the principal question, Levin was tormented by other questions. Were these people sincere? Were they not pretending? Or did they understand, possibly in some different and clearer way than he, the answers science gives to the questions he was concerned with? And he studied painstakingly both the opinions of those people and the books which contained their answers. One thing he had discovered since these questions had begun to occupy him, namely that he had been mistaken in imagining from his recollections of his youthful university circle that religion had outlived its day and no longer existed. All those near to him who lived good lives were people who believed the old Prince Lovov, of whom he had grown so fond, his brother Kosnichev, and all the women folk his wife believed as he had done in early childhood. And 99 out of 100 of the Russian people, the whole of the people whose lives he most respected, also believed. Another thing was that, having read a great many books, he became convinced that those who shared his outlook understood only what he had understood, explaining nothing and merely ignoring those problems without a solution to which he felt he could not live, but trying to solve quite other problems which could not interest him, such as, for instance, the development of organisms, a mechanical explanation of the soul, and so on. Besides, during the time of his wife's confinement, an extraordinary thing had happened to him. He, an unbeliever, began to pray, and while praying believed. But that moment had passed, and he could not allot any place in his life to the state of mind he had then experienced. He could not admit that he had then known the truth and was now making a mistake, because as soon as he reflected calmly about it, it all fell to pieces. Nor could he acknowledge that he had then been mistaken, for he prized the state his soul had then been in, and by acknowledging it to be a result of weakness, he would have defiled those moments. He was painfully out of harmony with himself and strained all of his spiritual powers to escape from this condition. Chapter 9. These thoughts oppressed and tormented him, now more and now less strongly, but never left him. He read and thought, and the more he read and thought, the further he felt from his goal. Latterly, in Moscow and in the country, having convinced himself that he could get no answer from the materialists, he read through and reread Plato, Spinoza, Kant, Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer, those philosophers who explained life otherwise than materialistically. Their thoughts seemed to him fruitful when he read or was himself devising refutations of other teachings, the materialistic in particular. But as soon as he began reading, or himself devised solutions to life's problems, the same thing occurred every time, following long definitions of vague words such as spirit, will, freedom, substance, and deliberately entering the verbal trap set for him by the philosophers or by himself. He seemed to begin to understand something, but he had only to forget that artificial line of thought and to return direct from real life to what had appeared satisfactory. So long as he kept to the given line of thought, and suddenly the whole artificial edifice tumbled down like a house of cards, and it was evident that the edifice had been constructed of those same words differently arranged, and without regard for something in life more important than reason. At one time, while reading Schopenhauer, he replaced the word will by the word love, and this new philosophy comforted him for a day or two, as long as he did not stand aside from it, but it collapsed when he viewed it in relation to real life, and it turned out to be a muslin garment without warmth. His brother Kosnovich advised him to read Homyakov's theological writings. Levin read the second volume of them, and in spite of its polemical, polished, and witty style, which at first repelled him, he was struck by its teaching about the church. He was struck by the thought that it is not given to isolated man to attain divine truth, but that it is given to a community united by love, the church. He was pleased by the thought that it was easier to believe in an existing living church which compounds all the beliefs of men, and has God at its head, and is therefore holy and infallible, and from it to accept belief in God, a distant, mysterious God, the creation, and so on. But afterwards, on reading the history of the church, first by a Roman Catholic and then by a Greek Orthodox writer, and finding that each essentially infallible church repudiated the other, he became disenchanted with Homyakov's teaching about the church, and that edifice fell into dust just as the philosophical structures had done all that spring. He was not himself, and experienced terrible moments without knowing what I am and why I am here. It is impossible to live, yet I cannot know that, and therefore I can't live, he said to himself. In an infinity of time and an infinity of matter, an infinite space, a bubble organism separates itself, and that bubble maintains itself a while and then bursts, and that bubble is I. This was a distressing falsehood, but it was the sole and last result of centuries and the age-long labor of human thought in that direction. It was the latest belief, it was the ruling conviction, and from among all other explanations, Levin, without himself knowing when or how, had involuntarily chosen it as being at any rate the clearest of all. But it was not only false, it was the cruel mockery of some evil power, a wicked and disgusting power, and one to which it was impossible to submit. It was necessary to free oneself from that power. The means of escape were in the hands of every man, an end had to be put to that dependence on an evil power, and there was one means, death. And though he was a happy and healthy family man, Levin was several times so near to suicide that he hid a cord he hid lest he should hang himself, and he feared to carry a gun lest he should shoot himself. But he did not hang or shoot himself, and went on living. Chapter 10. When Levin thought about what he was and why he lived, he could find no answer and was driven to despair. But when he left off asking himself those questions, he seemed to know what he was and why he lived, for he acted and lived unfilteringly, and definitely recently even more unfilteringly than before. When he returned to the country in June, he went back to his ordinary occupations, husbandry, intercourse with the peasants, and with his neighbors, management of his house and of his sisters' and brothers' affairs, which were entrusted to him, relations with his wife and relatives, cares about his baby, and a new hobby, beekeeping, which he took up with enthusiasm that spring occupied all his time. These matters interested him not because he justified them to himself by any general theories, as he had done previously. On the contrary, being now on the one hand disenchanted by the ill success of his former occupations for the general welfare, and on the other hand too much occupied with his own thoughts and by the massive affairs that overwhelmed him from all sides, he quite abandoned all calculation of public utility. And these matters interested him only because it seemed to him that he had to do what he was doing and could not act otherwise. Formerly, it had been so almost from childhood, and increasingly so till his complete maturity, when he tried to do anything for the good of everybody, for humanity, for Russia, for the whole village. He had noticed that the thoughts of it were agreeable, but the activity itself was always unsatisfactory. There was no full assurance that the work was really necessary, and the activity itself, which at first seemed so Great ever lessened, and lessened till it vanished. But now since his marriage, when he began to confine himself more and more to living for himself, though he no longer felt any joy at the thought of his activity, he felt confident that his work was necessary, saw that it progressed far better than formerly, and that it was always growing more and more now, as if involuntarily he cut ever deeper and deeper into the earth, so that he like a plowshare could not get out without turning the sod. For the family to live as their grandfathers and fathers have been accustomed to live, that is at the same educational level, and so to bring up their children, was undoubtedly necessary. It was just as necessary as to dine when hungry, and therefore, just as it was necessary to prepare dinner, so it was necessary to arrange the husbandry at Pokrovsk in such a way as to derive an income from it. As surely as one must pay one's debts, so surely was it necessary to keep the patrimony in such a state that when his son inherited it, he would thank his father, as Levin thanked his grandfather for all that he had built and planted. To do this, he must not lease the land, but must farm it himself, keep cattle, manure the fields, and plant woods. It was as impossible not to look after his brothers' and sisters' affairs, and those of all the peasants who came for advice and were accustomed to do so, as it is impossible to abandon a baby you are already holding in your arms. It was necessary to look after the comforts of his sister-in-law and her children, who had been invited, and of his wife and child, and it was impossible not to pass at least a small portion of each day with them. All this, with game shooting and his new hobby of beekeeping, filled up the whole of that life of his, which seemed to him, when he thought about it, to have no meaning. But besides knowing definitely what he had to do, Levin also knew how to do it all, and which affair was the more important of any two. He knew that he must hire laborers as cheaply as possible, but that he must not take them in bondage for less than they were worth by advancing them money. Though this would be very profitable, he might sell straw to the peasants in a time of shortage, though he felt sorry for them. But an inn or a public house, although it brought in a revenue, must be done away with. Felling trees must be punished as severely as possible. But if peasants let their cattle stray, he must not exact fines from them. And though it grieved the watchman and weakened discipline, the strayed cattle must not be detained. He must lend money to Piotr to liberate him from the usurers, to whom he was paying 10% a month. But he must neither reduce nor postpone the payments of rent by the peasants who were in default. The steward must not be excused when the small meadow was not mown and the grass was wasted. But grass must not be mown on the 80 dasyatnas, which had been planted with young trees. He must not pardon a laborer who went home at a busy time, because his father had died. Sorry as he might be for the man, part of his pay had to be deducted for the precious months during which he had been absent, but he could not neglect giving a monthly allowance to old domestic servants who were of no use at all to him. Levin knew too that on returning home, the first thing he must do was to go to his wife, who was unwell, and that the peasants who had been waiting for 3 hours to see him could wait a little longer, and he knew that in spite of all the pleasure of hiving a swarm, he must forego that pleasure. Let the old beekeeper hive the swarm without him and go to talk to the peasants who had found him at the apiary. Whether he was acting well or ill, he did not know, and far from laying down the law about it, he now avoided talking or thinking about it. Thinking about it led him into doubts and prevented him from seeing what he should and should not do. But when he did not think, but just lived, he unceasingly felt in his soul the presence of an infallible judge, deciding which of two possible actions was the better and which the worse. And as soon as he did what he should not have done, he immediately felt this. In this way, he lived not knowing or seeing any possibility of knowing what he was or why he lived in the world. And he suffered so much from that ignorance that he was afraid he might commit suicide, while at the same time he was firmly cutting his own particular definite path through life. Chapter 11. The day when Kosenkov arrived at Pokrovsk was one of Levin's most distressing days. It was the most pressingly busy season of the year, when an extraordinary tension of self-sacrificing labor manifests itself among all the peasants, such as is never shown in any other condition of life, and such as would be highly esteemed if the people who exhibit this quality esteemed it themselves, if it were not repeated every year, and if the results of that tension were not so simple: to mow or reap the rye and oats, and cart them, to finish mowing the meadows, to replow the fallow land, to thresh the seed corn, And so the winter rye, all this seems simple and ordinary, yet to get it all done, it is necessary that all the peasants, from the oldest to the youngest, should work unceasingly those 3 or 4 weeks 3 times, as hard as usual, living on kavas, onions, and black bread, threshing and carting the sheaves by night, and sleeping not more than 2 or 3 hours out of the 24. And this is done every year all over Russia, having lived most of his life in the country and in close contact with the peasants. Levin always felt at this busy time that this general stimulation of the peasants communicated itself to him early in the morning. He rode to where the first rye was being sown, then to see the oats carted and stacked, and returning home when his wife and sister-in-law were getting up, he drank coffee with them and then walked to the farm where the new threshing machine was to be started to thresh the seed corn. All that day, when talking to the steward and the peasants, and at home with his wife Dolly, her children, and his father-in-law, Levin's thoughts were busy with the one and only subject outside his farming that interested him at this time, and in everything he sought its relation to his questions: what am I, where am I, and why am I here, standing in the cool shade of the newly thatched barn with its wattle walls of hazel, which had not yet shed its scented leaves, pressed against the freshly stripped aspens of the roof tree under the thatch. He looked now through the open doorway, into which the dry and bitter chaff dust rushed and whirled, at the grass round a threshing floor lit up by the hot sunshine, and at the fresh straw that had just been brought out of the barn now, at the bright-headed and white-breasted swallows that flew in chirping beneath the roof and flapping their wings. Paused in the light of the doorway, and now at the people who bustled about in the dark and dusty barn, and he thought strange thoughts. Why is all this being done? He wondered, why am I standing here obliging them to work? Why do they all make such efforts and try to show me their zeal? Why is my old friend Matryona toiling so? I doctored her after the fire when she was struck by a girder, he thought, looking at a thin peasant woman who pushed the grain along with a rake, her dark sunburned bare feet stepping with effort on the hard, uneven barn floor. She recovered then, but today or tomorrow or in 10 years' time, they will bury her, and nothing will be left of her, nor of that smart girl with the red skirt, who with such dexterous and delicate movements is beating the chaff from the ears. She too will be buried, and that piebald gelding too. And that one very soon, he reflected, looking at a horse breathing quickly, with falling and rising belly and inflated nostrils, as it trod on the slanting wheel that moved under it. They will bury her, and so they will theater, who is feeding the machine, his curly beard full of chaff, and his shirt torn on his white shoulder. Yet he loosens the sheaves and gives directions, shouts at the women, and quickly puts right the strap on the fly wheel. And moreover, not they only, but I too shall be buried, and nothing will be left. What is it all for? He thought this, and at the same time looked at his watch to calculate how much they could thresh. In an hour he had to know this in order to set them their day's task accordingly. They've been nearly an hour, and have only just started on the third heap. Thought he approached the man who was feeding the machine, and shouting above its din told him to put in less at a time. You put in too much at a time, Theodore. Don't you see it gets jammed? And that's why it does not go well. Feed it in evenly. Theodore, black with the dust that stuck to his perspiring face, shouted something in reply, but still did not do as Levain wished. Levain went up to the roller, motioned Theodore aside, and himself began feeding the machine. Having worked till the peasants' dinner hour, which soon came, he left the barn together with Theodore and began chatting. Standing beside the neat yellow, freshly reaped stack of seed rye on the threshing floor, Theodore came from the farther village, the one where Levin had formerly let the land to be worked cooperatively. At present, it was let to the innkeeper. Levin got into conversation with Theodore about that land, and asked whether Plato, a well-to-do and worthy peasant of that village, would not rent that land next year. The rent is too high, Constantine Demetrius answered Theodore, picking out the ears of rye from the front of his damp shirt. But how does Karlov make it pay? Why shouldn't Makuchka, as he contemptuously called the innkeeper, make it pay? Constantine Demetric, oh, that fellow will press hard, but he'll get his own. He will have no pity on a Christian. But as if Daddy Plato would ever skin a man he'll lend, and sometimes he'll let a man off, and so run short himself. It all depends on the sort of man. But why should he let anyone off? Well, you see, people differ. One man lives Only for his own needs take Machuca, who only stuffs his own belly. But Plato is an upright old man, he lives for his soul, and remembers God. How does he remember God? How does he live for the soul? Levin almost cried out, you know how rightly in a godly way you know people differ. Take you for instance. You won't injure anyone either. Yes, yes, goodbye, uttered Levin, gasping with excitement, and turning away he took his stick and walked quickly away toward home at the peasant's words about Plato living for his soul rightly in a godly way. Dim but important thoughts crowded into his mind, as if breaking loose from some place where they had been locked up, and all rushing toward one goal whirled in his head, dazzling him with their light. Chapter 12. Levin went along the high road with long strides, attending not so much to his thoughts. He could not yet disentangle them as to a condition of his soul. He had never before experienced the words the peasant had spoken produced in his soul the effect of an electric spark suddenly transforming and welding into one a whole group of disjointed, impotent, separate ideas, which had always interested him. These ideas, though he had been unconscious of them, had been in his mind when he was talking about letting the land. He felt something new in his soul and probed this something with pleasure, not yet knowing what it was to live not for one's needs, but for God. For what God? What could be more senseless than what he said? He said we must not live for our needs, that is, we must not live for what we understand and what attracts us, what we wish for, but must live for something incomprehensible, for God, whom nobody can understand or define well. And did I not understand those senseless words of Theodore's? And having understood them, did I doubt their justice? Did I find them stupid, vague, or inexact? No, I understand him just as he understands them, understood completely and more clearly than I understand anything in life. And I have never in my life doubted it, and cannot doubt it, and not I alone, but everyone. The whole world only understands that completely. Nobody is free from doubt about other things, but nobody ever doubts this one thing. Everybody always agrees with it. And I sought for miracles, regretted not to see a miracle that might convince me. A physical miracle would have tempted me, but here is a miracle, the one possible everlasting miracle all around me, and I did not notice it. Theodore says that Kiriloff the innkeeper lives for his belly. Oh, that is intelligible and reasonable. We all as reasoning creatures cannot live otherwise. And then that same Theodore says that it is wrong to live for one's belly, and that we must live for truth, for God. And at the first hint I understand him. I and millions of men who lived centuries ago, and those who are living now, peasants, the poor in spirit, and sages who have thought and written about it, saying the same thing in their obscure words. We all agree on that one thing, what we should live for, and what is good. I and all other men know only one thing firmly, clearly, and certainly, and this knowledge cannot be explained by reason. It is outside reason, has no cause, and can have no consequences. If goodness has a cause, it is no longer goodness. If it has a consequence, a reward, it is also not goodness. Therefore goodness is beyond the chain of cause and effect. It is exactly this that I know, and that we all know. What greater miracle could there be than that? Can I possibly have found the solution of everything? Have my sufferings really come to an end? Thought Levin, as he strode along the dusty road, oblivious of the heat of his fatigue and filled with a sense of relief from long continued suffering. That feeling was so joyous that it seemed questionable to him. He was breathless with excitement and incapable of going further. He turned from the road into the wood and sat down on the uncut grass in the shade of the aspens. Taking the hat from his perspiring head, he lay down, leaning his elbow upon the juicy, broad-bladed forest grass. Yes, I must clear it up and understand it, he thought, gazing intently at the untrodden grass before him and following the movements of a green insect that was crawling up a stalk of couch grass and was hindered in its ascent by a leaf of goutwort. What have I discovered? He asked himself, turning back the leaf, that it should not hinder the insect, and bending another blade for the creature to pass on to. What gladdens me? What have I discovered? I have discovered nothing. I have only perceived what it is that I know. I have understood the power that not only gave me life in the past, but is giving me life now. I have freed myself from deception and learned to know my master. I used to say that in my body, in this grass, in this insect there, it did not want to get onto that grass, but has spread its wings and flown away. There takes place, according to physical, chemical, and physiological laws, a change of matter and in all of us including the aspens, and the clouds and nebulae. Evolution is proceeding evolution, from what into what, unending evolution and struggle as if there could be any direction, and struggle in infinity. And I was surprised that in spite of the greatest effort of thought on that path, the meaning of life, the meaning of my impulses and my aspirations was not revealed to me. But now I say that I know the meaning of my life. It is to live for God, for the soul, and that meaning, in spite of its clearness, is mystic and wonderful. And such is the meaning of all existence. Ah yes, pride, he said to himself, turning over face downwards and beginning to tie blades of grass into knots, trying not to break them. And not only mental pride, but mental stupidity, and chiefly roguery of mind. Precisely roguery, just mind swindling, he repeated. He briefly reviewed the whole course of his thoughts during the last 2 years, beginning with the clear and obvious thought of death at the sight of his beloved brother hopelessly ill, having then for the first time clearly understood that before every man and before himself there lay only suffering, death, and eternal oblivion. He had concluded that to live under such conditions was impossible, that one must either explain life to oneself so that it does not seem to be an evil mockery by some sort of devil, or one must shoot oneself. But he had done neither the one nor the other, yet he continued to live, think, and feel, had even at that very time got married, experienced many joys, and been happy whenever he was not thinking of the meaning of his life. What did that show? It showed that he had lived well, but thought badly. He had lived without being conscious of it by those spiritual truths which he had imbibed with his mother's milk, but in thought he had not only not acknowledged those truths, but had studiously evaded them. Now it was clear to him that he was only able to live thanks to the beliefs in which he had been brought up. What should I have been, and how should I have lived my life if I had not had those beliefs, and had not known that one must live for God and not for one's own needs? I should have robbed, lied, and murdered. Nothing of that which constitutes the chief joys of my life would have existed for me, and although he made the greatest efforts of imagination, he could not picture to himself the bestial creature he would have been had he not known what he was living for. I looked for an answer to my question, but reason could not give me an answer. Reason is incommensurable with the question. Life itself has given me the answer in my knowledge of what is good and what is bad, and that knowledge I did not acquire in any way. It was given to me as to everybody given, because I could not take it from anywhere. Where did I get it from? Was it by reason that I attained to the knowledge that I must love my neighbor and not throttle him? They told me so when I was a child, and I gladly believed it, because they told me what was already in my soul. But who discovered it? Not reason. Reason has discovered the struggle for existence and the law that I must throttle all those who hinder the satisfaction of my desires. That is the deduction reason makes. But the law of loving others could not be discovered by reason, because it is unreasonable. Chapter 13. Levin remembered a recent scene between Dolly and her children left by themselves. The children had started cooking raspberries over a candle and pouring jets of milk into their mouths when their mother caught them at this pursuit. She began in Levin's presence to impress on them how much trouble what they were wasting had cost grown-up people, that trouble had been taken for them, that if they broke cups they would not have anything to drink tea out of, and if they spilt milk they would not have anything to eat and would die of hunger. And Davy was struck by the quiet, dull disbelief with which the children listened to these remarks from their mother. They were only grieved that their amusing game had been ended, and they did not believe a word of what she was saying, and they could not believe it because they could not imagine the whole volume of all they consumed, and therefore could not conceive that what they were destroying was the very thing they lived on. That's quite a different matter, they thought, and not in the least interesting or important, because those things always have been and always will be. It is always the same thing over and over again. There is no need for us to think about that. It's already for us, but we want to think out something of our own. Invention and new. Now we've thought of putting raspberries in a cup and cooking them over a candle, and of pouring milk into each other's mouths like fountains. That is amusing and new, and not at all worse than drinking out of cups, don't we? And didn't I do just the same when intellectually I sought for the meaning of the forces of nature and the purpose of human life, he went on thinking, and don't all the philosophical theories do the same, when by ways of thought strange and unnatural to man they lead him to a knowledge of what he knew long ago, and knows so surely that without it he could not live? Is it not evident in the development of every philosopher's theory, that he knows in advance as indubitably as the peasant Theodore, and not a whit more clearly than he the chief meaning of life, and only wishes by a questionable intellectual process to return to what everyone knows, supposing now that the children were left alone to procure or make cups for themselves and to milk the cows and so on? Would they play tricks? No, they would die of hunger. Suppose we with our passions and thoughts were left without the conception of God a creator, and without a conception of what is good, and without an explanation of moral evil. Try to build up anything without these conceptions we destroy, because we have our fill spiritually. We are children indeed, whence comes the joyful knowledge I have in common with the peasant, and which alone gives me peace of mind. Where did I get it? I educated in the conception of God as a Christian, having filled my life with the spiritual blessings. Christianity gave me brimful of these blessings, and living by them I like a child, not understanding them, destroy them. That is, I wish to destroy that by which I live. But as soon as an important moment of life comes, like children, when they are cold and hungry, I go to him, and even less than the children, whose mother scolds them for their childish mischief, do I feel that my childish attempts to kick, because I am filled, should be reckoned against me. Yes, what I know not by my reason, but because it has been given to me, revealed to me, and I know it in my heart, by faith in the chief thing which the church proclaims. The church. Levin repeated to himself. He turned over, and leaning on his elbows began looking at a herd of cattle in the distance approaching the river on the other side. But can I believe in all that the church professes? He asked himself, testing himself by everything which might destroy his present peace of mind. He purposely thought of those teachings of the church which always seemed most strange to him, and that tried him, the creation. But how do I account for existence? By nothing, the devil and sin. And how do I explain evil? A savior. But I know nothing, and can know nothing but what is told me, and to everybody. And it now seemed to him that there was not one of the dogmas of the church which could disturb the principal thing, faith in God and goodness, as the sole vocation of man. Each of the church's doctrines might be represented by faith in serving truth rather than serving one's personal needs, and each of them not only did not infringe that belief, but was necessary for the fulfillment of the chief miracle ever recurring on earth, the possibility of everyone, millions of most diverse people, sages and idiots, children and old men, peasants, lows of kitty, beggars and kings, indubitably understanding one and the same thing, and forming that life of the Spirit which alone is worth living for, and which alone we prize. Lying on his back, he was now gazing at the high cloudless sky. Don't I know that that is infinite space and not a rounded vault? But however I may screw my eyes and strain my sight, I cannot help seeing it round and limited, and despite my knowledge of it as limitless space, I am indubitably right when I see a firm blue vault, and more right than when I strain to see beyond it. Levin ceased to think, and only as it were hearkened to mystic voices that seemed to be joyously and earnestly discussing something. Can this really be faith? He wondered, afraid to believe in his happiness. My God, I thank thee, he uttered, repressing his rising sobs and wiping away with both hands the tears that filled his eyes. Chapter 14. Levin looked straight before him and saw the herd of cattle, and then his trap and his horse Raven, and the coachman, who having driven up to the cattle was speaking to the herdsman. After that, close by he heard the sound of wheels and the snorting of a well-fed horse. But he was so engrossed in his thoughts that he did not wonder why the coachman was coming for him. That occurred to him only when the coachman drove up and called to him, the mistress has sent me your brother and another gentleman have come. Yavin got into the trap and took the reins as if just awakened from a dream. It was long before he could collect his thoughts. He looked at the well-fed horse lathered between the legs, and on its neck where the reins chafed. It looked at Ivan the coachman sitting beside him, and remembered that he had been expecting his brother, that his wife was probably disturbed at his long absence, and he tried to guess who the visitor that had come with his brother might be. His brother, his wife, and the unknown visitor appeared in a different light to him. Now it seemed to him that his relations with everyone would now be Change there will be no disputes, with Kitty never any quarrels again, with the visitor whoever he may be I shall be amiable and kind, and with the servants with Ivan everything will be different. Tightly holding in the good horse, who snorted impatiently and pulled at the reins, Levin kept turning to glance at Ivan, who sat beside him, not knowing what to do with his unoccupied hands, and continually pushing down his shirt as the wind blew it out. Levin tried to think of some pretext for beginning a conversation with him. He wanted to say that it was a pity Ivan had pulled the saddle girth so tight, but that would have sounded like a reproof, and Levin desired an amicable conversation. But he could think of nothing else to say. "Bear to the right, sir, there's a stump there," said the coachman, taking hold of the rein. "Please leave it alone, and don't teach me," said Levin, annoyed at the coachman's interference, just as it always did. Interference vexed him, and he immediately felt how wrong had been his conclusion, that his spiritual condition could at once alter his manner when confronted with reality. When they were still a quarter of a verst from the house, Levin saw Grisha and Tanya running toward him. "Uncle Kostya, Mama is coming, and Grandpapa and Sergei Ivanich, and someone else," they cried, clambering into the trap. "Who else? An awfully dreadful man. And he goes like that with his hands," said Tanya, standing up in the trap and mimicking Katavasov. "Young or old?" asked Levin with a laugh, as Tanya's gestures reminded him of someone. "Oh, if only it is not someone disagreeable," he thought. As soon as he had turned the corner of the road and saw those who were approaching, he at once recognized Katavasov in a straw hat, waving his arms just as Tanya had represented. Katavasov was very fond of talking about philosophy, having a conception of it which he had acquired from naturalists who had never studied it, and in Moscow Levin had latterly had many disputes with him. One of those disputes, in which Katavasov evidently thought he had been the victor, was the first thing Yevgen remembered when he recognized him. "But I will not now on any account dispute or express my opinions lightly," he thought after alighting from the trap and welcoming his brother and Katavasov. Levin asked where Kitty was. "She has taken Mitya to Kalo," which was a wood not far from the house. "She wanted to let him sleep there. It's so hot in the house," said Dolly. Levin always advised his wife not to take the child into the wood, considering it dangerous, and this news was disagreeable to him. "She wanders about with him from place to place," said the old prince with a smile. "I advised her to try taking him to the ice cellar. She meant to come to the priory. She thought you were there." "We are going there," said Dolly. "Well, and what are you doing?" asked Kostin, lagging behind with his brother. "Oh, nothing particular. Busy with the estate, as usual," answered Levin. "Have you come for a good stay? We expected you long ago, for about a fortnight. I had a lot to do in Moscow." At these words the brothers' eyes met, and Levin, in spite of the desire he always felt, and now more than ever for friendly, and especially for simple relations, with his brother, felt ill at ease. While looking at him he dropped his own eyes, not knowing what to say, mentally reviewing the subjects that might interest Kosnichev and divert him from the Serbian war and the Slavonic question, at which he had hinted when mentioning his work in Moscow. Levin asked about Kosnichev's book. "Have any reviews of your book appeared?" he asked. Koshilev smiled at the obvious intent of the question. "No one concerns himself with it, and I least of all," he replied. "Look there, Dario Alexandrovna, it's going to rain," he added, pointing with his umbrella to some white clouds that had appeared above the aspen trees, and those words were enough to re-establish between the brothers the not exactly hostile but cold relations which Levin so wished to avoid. Levin joined Katov. "How right you were to come," he said. "I have long been meaning to. Now we'll have some talks, and we'll see. Have you read Spencer?" "No, I have not finished him," replied Gavin. "However, I don't need him now." "How's that? That's interesting. Why not?" "Well, I have finally convinced myself that I shan't find solutions of the questions I am concerned about in him or in people of his kind now." But he was suddenly struck by the calm and cheerful expression of Katavarsov's face, and felt so sorry to lose the spiritual condition which he was evidently spoiling by his conversation, that recollecting his resolution, he ceased speaking. "However, we'll have a talk later on," he said. "If we're going to the apiary, it's this way, along this path," he added, addressing the whole party, when by the narrow footpath they had reached the unmown glade, covered on one side by a thick growth of bright Jonathan Marys, with tall spreading bushes of dark green sneezewort between them. Levin asked his guests to sit down in the deep cool shade of the young aspens upon a bench, and some tree stumps specially arranged for visitors to the apiary, who might be afraid of bees, while he went to the hut to fetch bread, cucumbers, and fresh honey for the grown-up people, as well as for the children, trying to make as few brusque movements as possible and listening to the bees that flew past him more and more often. He went along the path to the hut. At the very entrance, a bee became entangled in his beard and began buzzing, but he carefully liberated it. He went into the shady lobby, and from a peg in the wall, took down his veil, put it on, and with his hands deep in his pockets entered the fenced in apiary, where standing in regular rows and tied with bast 2 stakes in the middle of a space where the grass had been mown stood the old beehives, everyone familiar to him and each with a history of its own, while along the wattle fence stood the new hives with the swarms, hive that year, in front of the hives, flickering before his eyes and circling and fluttering over the same spot played bees and drones, and between them flew the working bees, always to or from the wood with the blossoming lime trees, fetching and bringing back their loads. In his ears rang incessantly a variety of sounds, now of a busy working bee flying swiftly past, now of a buzzing idle drone, then of the excited bee sentinels guarding their treasure from a foe and prepared to sting. On the other side of the fence an old man was making a hoop and did not notice Levin, who stopped in the middle of the apiary without calling him. He was glad of this opportunity to be alone and recover from reality, which had already so lowered his spiritual condition. He remembered that he had already got angry with Ivan, treated his brother coldly, and spoken heedlessly to Katavaskov. Can it possibly have been but a momentary mood that will pass without leaving a trace, he wondered, but at that instant, returning into that mood, he felt with joy that something new and important had occurred within him. Reality had temporarily veiled the spiritual tranquility he had found, but it remained with him, just as the bees now circling round him, threatening him and distracting his attention, deprived him of complete physical calm and forced him to shrink to avoid them. So the cares that had beset him from the moment he got into the trap had deprived him of spiritual freedom, but that continued only so long as they surrounded him, and as in spite of the bees his physical powers remained intact, so his newly realized spiritual powers were intact also. Chapter 15. Costa, do you know with whom Sergei Ivanitch traveled coming here? Said Dolly, after she had distributed cucumbers and honey among the children with Vronsky. He is on his way to Serbia, yes, and not alone, but he's taking a squadron at his own expense, said Katavarsov. That is like him, said Livan, but are volunteers really still going? He added with a glance at Koshelov. Koshelov did not reply, but with the blunt side of a knife carefully extracted from a bowl in which lay a wedge of white honeycomb, a live bee that had stuck in the running honey. Yes, I should think so. You should have seen what went on at the station yesterday, said Katavasov, audibly biting into a cucumber. Well, how is one to understand it, in heaven's name? Sergei Ivanitch explained to me where all these volunteers are going and whom they are fighting, said the old prince, evidently continuing a conversation that had been started during Livan's absence. The Turks answered, Kosnichev quietly smiling, having extracted the bee which, black with honey, moved its legs helplessly as he shifted it from the knife to a firm aspen leaf. But who has declared war on Turkey? Ivan Ivanovich Ragozov and the Countess Lydia Ivanovna, assisted by Madame Stahl. No one has declared war, but people sympathize with their suffering neighbors and wish to help them, replied Kosnichev. But the prince is not talking of help, interposed Levin, taking his father-in-law's side, but of war. He says that private people cannot take part in war without the consent of the government. Akostia, look, here's a bee. Really? We shall get stung, cried Dolly, waving away a wasp. That's not a bee, it's a wasp, said Livan. Well, and what is your theory? asked Katavasov with a smile, evidently challenging Livan to a discussion. Why have private individuals no right? My theory is this. On the one hand, war is such a bestial, cruel, and terrible affair that no single man, not to speak of a Christian, can take on himself personally the responsibility for beginning a war. It can only be done by a government which is summoned to it, and is brought to it inevitably, on the other hand, by law and by common sense. In the affairs of state, and especially in the matter of war, citizens renounce their personal will. Koshelov and Katavarsov, ready with their rejoinders, began speaking both together. That's just the point, my dear fellow, that cases may arise when the government does not fulfill the will of its citizens, and then society announces its own will, said Katavarsov. But Kosakovsky evidently did not approve of this reply. He frowned at Katavasov's words and said something different. It is a pity you put the question that way. There is no declaration of war in this case, but simply an expression of human Christian feeling. Our brothers by blood and religion are being killed. Well, say they were not even our brothers or co-religionists, but simply children, women, and old people. One's feelings are outraged and Russians hasten to help to stop those horrors. Imagine that you were going along a street and saw a tipsy man beating a woman or a child. I think you would not stop to ask whether war had or had not been declared against that man, but you would rush at him and defend the victim. But I would not kill the man, replied Levin. Yes, you would. I don't know. If I saw such a thing, I might yield to my instinctive feeling. I can't say beforehand, but there is no such instinctive feeling about the oppression of the slaves, nor can there be. Perhaps you have none, but others have, said Kosnyshev with a dissatisfied frown. Among the people there live traditions of Orthodox Christians suffering under the yoke of the infernal Mussulman. The people have heard of their brothers' sufferings and have spoken out. Perhaps, said Lievian evasively, but I don't see it. I myself am one of the people, and I don't feel it, nor do I, said the prince. I was living abroad and read the papers and must own that I could not at all understand why, even before the Bulgarian atrocities, all Russians suddenly grew so fond of their Slavonic brothers. While I don't feel any love for them, I was much grieved and thought I was a monster that the Carlsbad waters had that effect on me. But on getting back I was relieved, for I see that there are others besides me who are only interested in Russia and not in their brother Slavs. Constantine is one. Personal opinions don't count in this matter, said Kosnovich. It is not an affair of personal opinions when all Russia, the people, has expressed its will. But forgive me, I don't see it. The people know nothing about it, said the prince. Oh papa, don't they? And on Sunday in church, remarked Dolly, who had been following the conversation. Please bring a towel, she said to the old man who was looking smilingly at the children. It's impossible that all but what was there in church on Sunday. The priest was ordered to read it. He did so. The people understood nothing, but they sighed as they always do during a sermon. Continued the prince. They were told that there would be a collection in the church for a soul-saving object, so they each took out a kopeck and gave it. But what it was for they did not know. The people can't help knowing. A consciousness of their destiny always exists in the people, and at moments like the present it becomes clear to them, said Kosnyshev, positively glancing at the old beekeeper. The handsome old man with a black beard turning gray in places and thick silvery hair stood motionless, with a bowl of honey in his hand, gazing kindly and calmly down from his height at the gentlefolk, clearly neither understanding them nor wishing to understand. That's just so, he said to Kosnyshev, and moved his head significantly. Yes, you better ask him. He neither knows nor thinks about it, said Liavin. Have you heard about the war, Mikhailik? He asked, addressing the old man. What they read in the church. What do you think? Ought we to fight for the Christians? Why should we think? Alexander Nikolaevich the emperor has thought for us and will think for us on all matters. He can see better. Shall I bring some more bread and give the laddie a bit? He asked Dolly, pointing to Grisha, who was finishing his crust. I have no need to ask, said Kosnyshev. We have seen and still see hundreds and hundreds of men who give up everything to serve the righteous cause, and who come from all ends of Russia and openly and clearly express their thoughts and aims. They bring their mites or go themselves and say straight out why they do it. What does that mean? It means, it seems to me, said Livan, beginning to get excited, that in a nation of 80 millions there can always be found not hundreds, as is now the case, but tens of thousands of men who have lost their social position, happy-go-lucky people who are always ready to go into Pugachev's rubber band, or to Kiev, or to Serbia. I tell you, it's not hundreds, and not the happy-go-lucky people, but the best representatives of the people, said Kosnyshev, as irritably as if he were defending the last of his possessions. And the donations there, at any rate the whole people directly expresses its will. That word people is so indefinite, said Livan. Clerks in district offices, schoolmasters, and 1 out of 1,000 peasants may know what it is all about. The rest of the 80 millions, like Mickiewicz, not only don't express their will, but have not the least idea what it is they have to express it about. What right have we then to say it is the will of the people? Chapter 16. Kosnyshev, an experienced dialectician, did not rejoin, but immediately turned the conversation into another region. Well, if you want to gauge the national spirit arithmetically, of course that is very difficult, 2. Do voting has not been introduced in our country and cannot be because it does not express the people's will. But there are other means. It is felt in the air, it is felt by the heart, not to mention the undercurrents that have stirred in the motionless sea of the nation, and which are evident to every unprejudiced person. Look at society in the narrower sense. The most divergent parties in the intellectual world, previously so hostile to one another, have all merged into one. All differences are at an end, and all the social organs say one and the same thing. All have felt an elemental force that has seized them and carries them all in one direction. Yes, all the papers say the same thing, said the prince. That's true, so much the same that they are just like frogs before a storm. They prevent our hearing anything else. Frogs or no frogs, I don't publish a newspaper and don't want to defend them, but I am speaking of the unanimity of the intelligent world, said Kosnichev, turning to his brother. Levin was going to reply, but the old prince interrupted him. About that unanimity, something else could be said, rejoined the prince. There's my son-in-law, Stepan Arkadyevich. You know him. He has now got the post of member of the committee of a commission of something other, I don't remember. Anyhow, there's nothing to do there. Well, Dolly, it's no secret, and the salary is 8,000. You just ask him if his work will be any use, and he will prove to you that it is most necessary, and he is a truthful man. But one can't help believing in the usefulness of 8,000 rubles. Yes, he asked me to tell Daria Alexandrovna that he has got the post, said Kosnichev discontentedly, considering that what the prince was saying was not to the point. So it is with the unanimity of the press. It has been explained to me, as soon as there is a war, their revenue is doubled. How can they help, considering that the fate of the people and the slaves and all the rest of it? There are many papers I don't like, but that is unfair, said Kosnichev. I would make only one stipulation, continued the prince. Alfonso Carr put it very well before the war with Prussia. You think war unavoidable? Very well. He who preaches war, off with him in a special legion to the assault, to the attack, in front of everybody else. The editors would be fine, remarked Kadavsov, laughing loudly and picturing to himself the editors of his acquaintance in that chosen legion. Oh, but they'd run away, said Dolly, and only be a hindrance. And if they run, put grape shot behind them, or Cossacks with whips, said the prince. That is a joke. And excuse me, prince, not a good joke, said Kosnash. I don't see that it is a joke, that began Levin, but Kosnichev interrupted him. Every member of society is called upon to do his proper task, he said, and men of thought perform theirs by expressing public opinion. The unanimous and complete expression of public opinion is a service rendered by the press, and is also a gratifying phenomenon. 20 years ago we should have been silent, but now we hear the voice of the Russian people, who are ready to arise as one man and to sacrifice themselves for their oppressed brethren. That is a great step and a sign of power, but it's not a question of sacrificing themselves only, but of killing Turks, remarked Levin timidly. The people sacrifice and are ready to sacrifice for the good of their souls, but not for murder, he added involuntarily, connecting the conversation with the thoughts that so engrossed him. What is that for their souls? You know, that expression is a puzzling one for a naturalist. What is a soul? Kadavov inquired with a smile. You know, no, I swear, I have not the slightest idea, said Katavasov, laughing loudly. I come not to bring peace, but a sword, said Christ, rejoined Kosnish from his own standpoint, quoting quite simply, as if it were quite comprehensible, the very passage from the Gospels that always perplexed Levin more than any other. That's just so, repeated the old man, who was standing nearby, answering a glance that was accidentally thrown at him. No, my dear sir, you are beaten, completely beaten, shouted Katavasov merrily. Levin flushed with annoyance, not at being beaten, but because he had not refrained from the dispute. No, I must not dispute with them. He thought they are clad in impenetrable armor, and I am naked. He saw that it was not possible to convince his brother and Katavasov, and still less did he see any possibility of himself agreeing with them. What they advocated was that same pride of intellect that had nearly ruined him. He could not agree that some dozen of men, among whom was his brother, had the right to assert on the strength of what they were told by some hundreds of grandiloquent volunteers who came to the city, that they and the newspapers expressed the will and the opinion of the people, an opinion, moreover, which found expression in vengeance and murder. He could not agree with this, because he neither saw the expression of those thoughts in the people among whom he lived, nor did he find any such thoughts in himself, and he could not consider himself as other than one of those who constituted the Russian people. Above all, he could not agree, because he together with the people did not know, and could not know wherein lay the general welfare, but knew definitely that the attainment of this welfare was only possible by a strict fulfillment of the law of goodness, which is revealed to every man, and therefore could not desire or preach war for any kind of general aims. He said the same as Michael, and the people who expressed their thought in the legend of the invitation to the variegates, come and rule over us. We joyfully promise complete obedience, all labors, all humiliations, all sacrifices we take upon ourselves. But we will not judge or decide. But the people now, according to his brother, were renouncing that exemption they had purchased at so high a price. He wanted to ask why, if public opinion is an infallible judge, is a revolution and a commune not as lawful as the movement in favor of the slaves. But all these were thoughts that could not decide anything. One thing could be seen indubitably, namely that this dispute was irritating his brother at the moment, and that therefore it was wrong to continue it. So Levin ceased to argue and drew his visitor's attention to the clouds that were gathering and to the fact that they had better get home before the rain began. Chapter 17. The prince and Kosnyshev got into the trap and drove off. The rest of the party, hastening their steps, went home on foot. But the cloud, now whiter, now blacker, approached so rapidly that it was necessary to hurry still more to reach home before the rain came. The forepart of the cloud, low and black like soot smoke, rushed with unusual swiftness across the sky. When they were still about 200 paces from the house, the wind had already risen, so that at any moment a downpour might be expected. The children, with frightened and joyful yells, ran on in front. Dolly, struggling with difficulty with the skirts that clung to her legs, no longer walked, but ran, her eyes fixed on the children. The men, holding their hats, went on with long strides. They were just reaching the porch when a large drop broke against the edge of the iron gutter. The children, followed by the grown UPS, ran talking merrily under the shelter of the roof, and Katerina Alexandrovna Levin asked Agatha Mikhailovna, who, carrying shawls and plaids, met them in the hall. "We thought she was with you," she answered, "and Mitya and Kola, I expect, and Nurse is with them." Levin snatched up the plaids and rushed to the clock. In that short time the center of the cloud had already so moved over the sun that it was as dark as during an eclipse. The wind, obstinately, as if insisting on having its way, pushed Levin back and tearing the leaves and blossoms off the lime trees, and rudely and strangely uncovering the white branches of birches, bent everything in one direction. The acacias, the flowers, the dock leaves, the grass, and the crests of the trees. The girls, who had been working in the garden, rushed screeching under the roof of the servants' quarters. A white curtain of pouring rain was already descending over the distant wood and half the neighboring field, and was advancing rapidly towards the Kalak. The moisture of the rain shattered into minute drops, filled the air, lowering his head and fighting against the wind, which was tearing the plaids out of his hands. Levin had almost reached the Kalak and could see something gleaming white behind an oak, when suddenly everything burst into flame. The earth seemed on fire, and just overhead the vault of heaven seemed to crack. When he opened his dazzled eyes, the first thing Levin saw with horror through the dense curtain of rain that now separated him from the Kalak was the strangely altered position of the green crown of a familiar oak in the middle of the wood. Has it been struck? He had barely time to think when, with quicker and quicker motion, the crown of the oak disappeared behind the other trees, and he heard the crash of a big tree falling onto other trees, the flash of lightning, the sound of thunder, and the sudden cold sensation of his body that was being drenched merged for Levin into one feeling of horror. Oh God, only not on them," he said, and though it occurred to him at once how senseless was his prayer that they should not be killed by the oak that had already fallen, he repeated it, knowing that he could do nothing better than utter that senseless prayer. Having run to the spot where they generally went, he did not find them there. They were at the other end of the wood under an old lime tree, and were calling him. To figures in dark dresses, they had been light-colored, before stood bending over something. They were Kitty and the nurse. The rain was already passing, and it was growing lighter when Levin reached them. The bottom of the nurse's dress was dry, but Kitty's dress was wet through and clung close to her. Though the rain had stopped, they were still standing in the same postures that they had adopted when the storm began. They stood leaning over a perambulator With a green hoot alive safe, thank God, he muttered, running up to them and splashing through the puddles, with one shoe half off and full of water. Kitty's wet and rosy face was turned to him timidly, smiling beneath her bedraggled hat. "Well, aren't you ashamed of yourself? I don't understand how one can be so imprudent," he reproached his wife in his vexation. "Really, it was not my fault. I was just wishing to go. When he became restless, we had to change his things. We had hardly—" Kitty began excusing herself. "Meteor was safe and dry and slept undisturbed. Well, thank God. I don't know what I'm saying. They collected the wet baby things, and the nurse took the baby in her arms and carried him." Levin walked beside his wife, feeling guilty at having been vexed, and stealthily, so that the nurse should not see, pressing Kitty's hand. Chapter 18. Throughout the whole day, amid most varied conversations, in which he took part only with what one may call the external side of his mind, Levin, despite his disillusionment with the change that should have taken place in him, did not cease to be joyfully aware of the fullness of his heart. After the rain, it was too wet to go out walking, besides which the thunder clouds had not cleared from the horizon, and now there passed thundering and darkening along the borders of the sky. So the whole company spent the rest of the day at home. No more disputes arose. On the contrary, after dinner, everyone was in the best of spirits. First, Katavasov amused the ladies with his original jokes, which on first acquaintance with him always pleased people, and afterwards, encouraged by Kosenkov, he recounted his very interesting observations on the differences in character and even in physiognomy between male and female house flies, and on their life. Kosnovsky too was in good spirits, and a TLED by his brother expanded his views of the future of the Eastern question, and did it so simply and well that everyone listened attentively. Only Kitty could not hear him to the end. She was called away to bath Misha a few minutes after she had gone. Levin too was called to her in the nursery, leaving his tea and regretting the interruption in the interesting conversation, yet uneasy as to why he was sent for, as this only happened on important occasions. Levin went to the nursery, though Kosenkov's plan, which Levin had not heard to the end, of how a liberated Slavonic world, 40 million strong, should together with Russia commence a new epoch in history, interested him very much as something quite new to him. And though he was disturbed by curiosity and anxiety as to why he had been summoned, yet as soon as he had left the drawing room and was alone, he immediately recollected his thoughts of the morning, and all these considerations of the importance of the Slavonic element in universal history seemed to him so insignificant in comparison with what was going on in his soul, that he immediately forgot them all and returned to the frame of mind he had been in that morning. He did not now recall, as he had done before, the whole course of his thoughts. He did not now need to. He at once returned to the feeling that directed him, which was related to those thoughts, and he found that feeling in his soul yet more powerful and definite than before. Now it was not as it used to be with him, when he had invented ways of tranquilizing himself and had been obliged to recapitulate the whole train of reflections in order to arrive at the feeling. Now, on the contrary, the feelings of joy and tranquility were more vivid than before, and his thoughts could not keep pace with them. He went through the veranda and looked at two stars that had appeared on the already darkening sky, and suddenly he remembered, yes, as I looked at the sky I thought that the vault I see is not a delusion. But then there was something I did not think out, something I hid from myself, he thought. But whatever it was, it cannot have been a refutation. I need only think it over, and all will become clear. Just as he was entering the nursery, he remembered what it was he had hidden from himself. It was that if the principal proof of the existence of a deity is his revelation of what is good, why is that revelation confined to the Christian Church alone? What relation to that revelation had the Buddhist and the Mohammedan faiths, which also teach and do good? It seemed to him that he had a reply to that question, but he had no time to express it to himself before he entered the nursery. Kitty was standing with her sleeves rolled up beside the bath, in which the baby was splashing about, and hearing her husband's step, she turned her face toward him, beckoning him with a smile, with one hand supporting the head of the plump, kicking baby who floated on his back. With the other she squeezed the water from a sponge over him, regularly exerting the muscles of her arm. There, come and look, she said, When her husband came up, Agafi Mikhailov was right. He does recognize. The point was that Mitya had that day obviously and undoubtedly begun to recognize his own people directly. Levin approached the bath. He was shown an experiment which succeeded perfectly. The cook, who had been called specially for the purpose, bent over him. He frowned and moved his head from side to side in a protesting way. Kitty bent over him, and his face lit up with a smile. He pressed his hand into the sponge and bubbled with his lips, producing such a contented and peculiar sound that not only Kitty and the nurse, but Levin too went into unexpected raptures. The nurse lifted the baby out of the bath with one hand and poured fresh water over him. Then he was wrapped up and dried, and after a penetrating yell he was given to his mother. "Well, I'm glad you are beginning to be fond of him," said Kitty to her husband when, with the child at her breast, she had sat down in her usual place. "I am very glad, for I was beginning to be grieved about it. You said you felt nothing for him." "No, did I say I felt nothing? I only said I was disillusioned." "What disillusioned with him?" "Not so much with him as with my own feeling. I had expected more. I had expected that, like a surprise, a new pleasant feeling would awaken in me. And then instead of that, nothing but repulsion and pity." She listened attentively, replacing on her slender fingers across the baby the ring she had taken off to bath Mitya, and above all, the anxiety and pity were far greater than the pleasure. "But today, after that fright during the storm, I have realized how much I love him." Kitty brightened up with a smile. "Were you very frightened?" she asked. "I was too, but to me it appears more dreadful now that it is past. I shall go and look at that oak. But how nice Katavasov is, and in general the whole day has been so pleasant. And you are so nice to your brother when you like. Well, go to them. It is always hot and steamy here after the bath." Chapter 19. When on leaving the nursery Levin was alone, he at once remembered the thought that had not seemed quite clear. Instead of going back to the drawing room whence came the sound of voices, he stopped on the veranda and, leaning on the balustrade, gazed at the sky. It had grown quite dark, and to the south where he was looking the sky was clear. The clouds were in the opposite direction. Their lightning flashed and distant thunder rolled. Levin listened to the rhythmical dripping of raindrops from the lime trees in the garden and looked at a familiar triangular constellation and at the Milky Way, which with its branches intersected it at every flash of lightning. Not only the Milky Way, but even the bright stars vanished. But immediately afterwards, they reappeared in the same places, as if thrown there by some unerring hand. "Well, what is perplexing to me?" Levin asked himself, feeling in advance that the solution of his doubts, though as yet unknown to him, was already in his soul. "Yes, the one evident, indubitable manifestation of the deity is the law of goodness disclosed to men by revelation, which I feel within myself, and in the confession of which I do not so much unite myself as I am united, whether I will or not, with other people in one community of believers, which is called the Church. But the Jews, Mohammedans, Confucians, Buddhists, what of them?" he questioned, putting to himself the query that seemed to him dangerous. "Is it possible that those hundreds of millions of people are deprived of that highest blessing, without which life has no meaning?" he pondered, but he immediately corrected himself. "But what am I asking about?" he said to himself. "I am asking about the relation to the deity of all the different beliefs of mankind. I am asking about the general revelation of God to the whole universe, with all those cloudy nebulae. What am I doing? To me personally, to my heart, has been indubitably revealed a knowledge unattainable by reasoning, and I obstinately wish to express that knowledge by reason. And in words, do I not know that it is not the stars that are moving?" he asked himself, looking at a bright planet that had already shifted its position by the top branch of a birch tree. "But I, watching the movement of the stars, cannot picture to myself the rotation of the earth. And I am right in saying that the stars move, and could the astronomers understand and calculate anything if they took into their calculation the whole of the complicated and varied motions of the earth? All their wonderful conclusions as to the distances, weights, movements, and disturbances of the heavenly bodies are based on their visible movement round a stationary earth, on this very movement that is now before me, and which has been the same to millions of people during the centuries. And that has been and will be the same and can always be verified. And just as astronomers' conclusions would be idle and uncertain were they not based on observations of the visible sky in relation to one meridian and one horizon, So would my conclusions be idle and uncertain were they not founded on that understanding of goodness which was and will be the same always and for everyone, and which has been revealed to me by Christianity, and can always be verified in my soul. The question of other creeds and their relation to the deity, I have not the right or possibility of deciding. Oh, you've not gone? Suddenly asked Kitty, who was passing that way to the drawing room. Nothing has upset you, has it? She inquired, peering attentively into his face by the starlight, but she would not have been able to discern its expression had not a flash of lightning that effaced the stars lit it up. By the light of that flash she saw the whole of his face, and noticing that he was calm and happy, she smiled at him. She understands, thought he, she knows what I'm thinking about. Shall I tell her? Or not? Yes, I will. But just as he was going to speak, she began, Oh, Castia, be good and go to the corner room and see how they have arranged things for Sergei Ivanitch. I can't very well do it myself. Have they put in the new washstand? Yes, certainly I will, said Livan, standing upright and kissing her. No, I had better not tell her, he thought when she had passed out before him. It is a secret necessary and important for me alone, and inexpressible in words. This new feeling has not changed me, has not rendered me happy, nor suddenly illuminated me as I dreamt it would, but is just like my feeling for my son. It has not been a surprise either. But be it faith or not, I do not know what it is. This feeling has also entered imperceptibly through suffering and is firmly rooted in my soul. I shall still get angry with Ivan the coachman in the same way, shall dispute in the same way, shall inappropriately express my thoughts. There will still be a wall between my soul's holy of holies and other people. Even my wife I shall still blame for my own fears, and she repent of it. My reason will still not understand why I pray, but I shall still pray, and my life, my whole life, independently of anything that may happen to me, is every moment of it no longer meaningless as it was before, but has an unquestionable meaning of goodness with which I have the power to invest at the end. Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.